Hello, everyone. I wanted to chat with you a little bit about the Deuteropauline epistles. And when I talk about the Deuteropaulines, I first would need to talk to you a little bit about the meaning of the word deutero in Greek. Deutero, as you see down here in Greek, means secondary. And so the Deuteropauline epistles are the letters that are attributed to Paul. Paul is listed in the prescript, but many scholars agree that they may not be actually written by Paul. And so when we talk about the Deuteropaulines, we can distinguish between the authentic letters of Paul, 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon, and then 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians, which are regarded as Paul's letters, but are Deuteropauline, and then the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, all which have this secondary quality about them. And let me explain a little bit about the process of copying and what this might be due to, and then I'll get into how scholars know the difference between the authentic and the Deuteropauline letters. First thing I want to talk about with you are two terms: pseudonymity and pseudepigrapha. And it's important for us to distinguish between these two terms. Pseudonymity is the process by which a false name is applied to a document either by the author himself or by a later copyist. And this was a practice that was relatively common in the early period in the first century and before the first century. We have a lot of pseudepigrapha, and that's the word here for documents that have these false names attributed to them. We have a number of pseudepigrapha, Old Testament pseudepigrapha and New Testament pseudepigrapha, and these are all documents that did not make it into the canon of the New Testament or the canon of the Old Testament, but are attributed many times to famous figures from the past. We have the books of Enoch, we have the Testament of Abraham, we have a whole bunch of these documents. Many of them are like Revelation. They're apocalyptic and very strange writings. And we think probably that the author, for whatever reasons, did not want to claim authorship of these, but wanted these attributed to someone famous in the past. So in a way, we can look at the Deuteropaulines as similar, maybe not necessarily as pseudepigrapha, but as similar because someone else may have authored them, but may not necessarily have been Paul. But they put Paul's name on it. Why would they do that? Why would they do that? Bart Ehrman has become quite famous for calling these forgeries, and he questions whether there might be a profit motive for these, or whether it's to get publicity, or to get your name forward, or maybe allegiance to your master. I don't know. I don't think these are forgeries per se. I think it has to do with how Paul's letters, all of Paul's letters, were written. Remember, when we talked about Paul's writings, that's kind of a misnomer. Paul probably took put his hand to the document at times. We know, for example, at the end of Galatians, he says, "See with what big letters I write." We know in Philemon, for example, Paul says, "I write this with my own hand. I owe you you owe me everything, Philemon, but I'll repay you." So he probably was dictating, and in fact, at the end of Romans, we have a very clear indication that he had a scribe. I, Tertius, wrote this in chapter 16. Towards the end of chapter 16, the scribe takes credit for having written down the document that Paul dictated. when we think about how Paul governed his ministry, we can imagine that Paul had his scribes and he had his co-workers, and he was training his scribes to know his mind. And so when he dictated, they could complete his sentences for him. They could write out his ideas, his thoughts and ideas. And I think by the time you get to the Deuteropaulines, by the time you get to 2 Thessalonians, by the time you get to Colossians and Ephesians, probably Paul is still in the picture, but he has a scribe well enough trained that he can dictate maybe portions of the letter and then let the scribe fill in the rest. By the time you get to 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, I suppose Paul may be off the scene by now, but whoever's authoring those texts is a disciple of Paul, and so it's still a product of Paul's school. So what I'm suggesting is that Paul had his own group of disciples, his own group of scribes, of people whom he taught. And so there was a Pauline school who learned from Paul while Paul was dictating and authoring the authentic Paulines and continued on his tradition with some of these other letters. So how do we know this? How do we know that what's going on here? If we look at some of these letters, 2 Thessalonians really in structure and in language is very similar to 1 Thessalonians. So if Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians, he may have asked whoever was writing 2 Thessalonians for him, his scribe, to copy large portions of it and alter it for a new audience and send it out. It could be that 2 Thessalonians, which seems to be more global in nature, it seems to be more ecumenical in nature. In other words, it seems to be to a broader audience than just the folks in Thessalonica. It could be that it originated somewhere from that congregation and with Paul's permission was then sent out and shared with others. Colossians is, I think, before Ephesians. And what's interesting about Colossians is that there are 87 words in Colossians, in that small little 3-chapter, 4-chapter, whatever, how many chapters it has, letter. 87 words that do not appear in the authentic Pauline letters. That's a lot. Not only that, there are 34 so-called hapax legomena. I've written that word out, that fancy word, which means words that occur only once in the New Testament, only in Colossians and nowhere else. Stylistically, grammatically, it is much longer. So all of you know that people have a certain style of talking. You know that Dr. Hume has a certain style of talking. He talks long and drawn out, and my lectures are great for putting people who have insomnia back to sleep. Well, Paul had his own style. It was short and pithy, but Colossians is much longer. The sentences are, it's more complicated, much better Greek. Ephesians, when we look at Ephesians, looks largely like a knockoff of Colossians, and in fact it shares a third of the vocabulary with Colossians. It's very much overlap. Ephesians is even more distinctive in that it has 116 words that are not found in the authentic Paulines. And it really does seem to be dependent upon Colossians. There's extensive verbatim agreement, combining and conflating of passages. It's like sometimes students will write, they should not do this. They might write a paper for one class and then combine some of what they've written and take it and move around paragraphs and things and submit it for another class. Do not do that. Now, when you're a professional, you can do some of that. You know, if you've got a letter that you've written, a form letter that you've written for a category of business that you're doing, and you need to adapt that letter, you know, certainly. I have at times been on the job market or known folks who are on the job market. It's nice if you have time to write a letter that is tailored to every job, a letter of interest, but sometimes you know have certain things that you want to repeat and that you've written, you've gotten it clean and good, well written. You know, you can overlap and use things. People do this. So it shouldn't come as a shock that, you know, especially in Colossians and Ephesians, when Paul seems to be in captivity, there's captivity letters, he's in prison, that he's able to maybe perhaps dictate portions of Colossians and maybe portions of Ephesians as well to his scribe, but then he trusts his scribe to say, you know, take the ideas we were talking about, whenever, last week, 2 weeks ago, and write it up, bring it to me and sign it. And for Ephesians, take a little bit of what we were talking about. You know, remember that letter we wrote to Colossians? Take a little bit of that and combine that, bring that to me. Let's read it together and I'll, you know, sign it and send it off. I think that's probably what may have been going on with these letters, especially because they're both captivity letters. So Paul had a hand in them. You know, I mean, these are good people, right? Proficient professionals train their assistants to know their minds, to do to respond in a way that they would respond. A good secretary knows how to write your letter for you, so you can just say, hey, write a letter to so and so about such and such, put this and this and then let me send it. Unfortunately, with email nowadays and with computers, we don't do as much of this because we type out our own things and we allow the computer to be our secretary. But I often wonder what gets lost in the mentoring and teaching process by the fact that the technology makes writing so much easier for all of us. I think something gets lost there. You know, people may not learn the way their boss thinks as well when they're not taking the dictation that was probably common in earlier periods. By the time you get to 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, it's radically different vocabulary from the other Paulines, and it reflects a very different structure of the church. And it has very clear expectations of the roles of the individual in the church community as well as in the home. These are very different from even Colossians and Ephesians. There are overlaps, of course, but I think probably Paul is off the scene by the time that these are being written. And as I said earlier, his disciple knows his mind well enough but doesn't want to assert his own authority. He has such discipline and such a sense of concern for his master that he's not going to usurp him with his own voice. But probably everyone knew, and the recipients of these letters knew, that Paul may have passed away, but it's continuing the Pauline tradition, right? This isn't so strange. This isn't so strange. Billy Graham passed away recently, a little while ago, but interestingly enough, I heard an interview with Franklin Graham and his son, and they said, so now that your father is passed away, are you going to continue publishing his column? He has a weekly newspaper column, had a weekly newspaper column. And the Billy Graham Evangelistic Society, his son, said, yes, we're going to continue publishing his column. So people can still write Billy Graham, even though he's passed away. You can still write him with your concerns and cares and problems and issues. And there's a group of students, I guess, of Billy Graham, of devotees, of disciples who know his writings inside and out, and they're going to go into his archives and they're going to select some passage from his sermons or from his writings, from his extensive library, edit it, rearrange it, put it together, maybe write a little bit of their own as long as it's in the spirit of Billy Graham, and publish it in Billy Graham's name. That's not so weird, and no one's really offended by that. I think that's similar to what was going on here with Paul's letters. Now, this is shocking for folks because they say, well, this is scripture. Well, yes, it's scripture, but it doesn't mean that it can't be inspired and still have been written in the way that I'm describing. However, it does make us question and think about the differing audience and the different context and the different time to which these letters are addressed. And so when you look at the primary themes for the Deuteropaulines, there are three things that I would want to hold up. The first thing we see when we read through these is the need for church order. This is a move from charismatic to ordered society. Paul was a charismatic leader. He had an interim ethics. He believed Christ was coming any moment. And so he didn't necessarily need for his decisions to be all lasting, because if Christ is coming, 3 weeks from now, what I tell the church in terms of its order, it just has to hold for a few weeks until Christ returns. By the time we get to these letters, there's not as much talk about Christ's return. It seems to be actually projected out into the future now. And so this is the next generation. I like Star Trek, but think of this as the next generation. This is the next generation Starship. This is the next generation Paul. Okay, so we might be around for a little while, Paul. We can't just, it's the difference between, okay, I'm going to use the Star Trek analogy a little bit more. It's the difference between Captain Kirk, who did a lot of stuff off the cuff, and Captain Picard, who had a long tradition of the Academy and the teaching in Starfleet and rules and regulations that he follows. And so we have a lot more discussion about the Prime Directive in the next generation. This is true also in these Deuteropaulines. We have a lot of discussion about how to order the church. And you do that because Christ is maybe not coming right away. You also have the significance of tradition. When you don't have a charismatic leader, you also need someone who is maybe focused on policy, doctrine, teaching. These things are more important than the creativity, right? Maybe you've been in work situations, church situations where you had a creative, charismatic leader who sort of created a lot of stuff and did a lot of stuff, and then needed to be replaced by someone who was more policy-oriented to sort of hedge things back. Well, this is what's going on here in the Deuteropaulines. And then you have to guard against heresies. And so there's a real strong tradition of correct, orthodox teaching with a strong sense of a high Christology. And then finally, you have to have these ethical issues. How do you live as a Christian? How does your household managed in a Greco-Roman world? And there, I think, we see some very, very interesting things going on in the household codes. Because as you order that household for the next generation, you've got to be looking at the relationship between your household and the households next door and the households in your town. And you can't be too much of an outlier, but you want to maintain the traditions that were established by Paul and that were established by others. So these are the themes of the Deuteropaulines. I'll review some other themes as well as Paul and the Deuteropaulines' understanding of women here in a second in another lecture, but I think this is worthy of discussion here. So I hope this was a helpful lecture in understanding what's going on with these Deuteropaulines.